Isaiah Thomas, as Floyd Mayweather told us on this show a couple weeks ago, is a legitimate MVP candidate.
In terms of his fourth quarter performances this year, not just his ability to score from the field, but his ability to get to the free throw line, his quickness, being a lefty, unorthodox, which is what you pointed to the other day, because you said it's a bit tricky to guard him because he's a lefty. All of those things are serving as a point to buffer the argument that this dude in the fourth quarter may be the most elite player right now.
He is the...
Thomas on the drive, pull-up jumper, it's good! Isaiah Thomas gives the Celtics the lead with 2.4 remaining.
Isaiah Thomas has had one of the biggest fall from graces the league has ever seen. In 2017, he was averaging 29 points per game for the one-seeded Celtics and was a top 5 MVP candidate. And just a few years later, he's out the league begging for an opportunity. It's a really sad story of how a super small player who overcame the odds to reach NBA stardom, gave his all for the city of Boston, only to get betrayed and cut loose by the same organization that he sacrificed everything for. This is the story of Isaiah Thomas. Isaiah Thomas has been overlooked nearly his entire basketball career, and despite being underappreciated, he's always managed to prove his worth. He was taken with the last pick in the 2011 NBA draft by the Sacramento Kings. Despite having a great college career, where he had a good junior year at Washington and scored 28 points and hit a game-winning buzzer beater in overtime to lead the Huskies to victory over Arizona in the championship game, he was still overlooked during the draft process. It didn't matter that Isaiah Thomas dominated in the Pac-10 tournament. Scouts and executives still overlooked Isaiah because at 5'8", he was super small compared to NBA players. The average height of an NBA player is 6'6", so at 5'8", Isaiah Thomas was extremely undersized in a league ruled by giants. But what those executives and scouts failed to realize was that despite his miniature stature, Isaiah Thomas had the heart of a lion that would eventually make him an NBA superstar. Furthermore, Isaiah may have been small, but he was a next level athlete. At the draft combine, Isaiah measured with the 4th highest vertical among all players, measuring with an insane 40-inch vertical. Isaiah Thomas may be only 5'8", but thanks to those insane hops, he could dunk the ball as if he were 6'8". He could do windmills and all sorts of slam dunk contest level throwdowns. He was also top 5 in sprints, and he could bench press 185 pounds 13 times. So as we can see, Isaiah Thomas may have been undersized, but he was extremely fast, strong, and bouncy. He was one of the most athletic players at the draft combine, but 29 NBA teams decided to pass on Isaiah despite those insane draft combine results, and they would eventually regret that decision. Isaiah Thomas showed very early in his NBA career that those other NBA teams made a huge mistake letting him slide all the way to the 60th pick. On March 1st of 2012, Isaiah Thomas was named the Western Conference Rookie of the Month, averaging 11 points and 4 assists per game in the month of February, becoming the first player in league history to win the award despite being the last pick in the draft. And he repeated that same success the following month, upping his averages to 13 points and 5 assists per game, and once again taking home Rookie of the Month honors. At the end of the season, Isaiah Thomas was named to second All-Rookie team and finished top 7 in Rookie of the Year voting. Despite being only 5'8" and being the last pick of the draft, Isaiah Thomas was a top 10 rookie in the league that season. A lot of players fall off after having one good rookie year in the NBA. Other players that made that same All-Rookie team, like Derek Williams, Marshawn Brooks, and Iman Shumpert, didn't do anything else noteworthy after having a good rookie year. But Isaiah Thomas had an insane work ethic that helped him to improve every season. By his third year, Isaiah Thomas was putting up all-star numbers, averaging 20 points and 6 assists per game on 45% shooting. Despite those impressive numbers, even his own team, the Sacramento Kings, underappreciated him because in the summer of 2014, Isaiah Thomas was traded to the Suns for essentially nothing. In a sign-and trade to the Suns, the Kings got back a $7 million trade exception and the rights to Alex Oriaki, a player who would never even play for their team. The Kings thought that Isaiah was just a player putting up empty stats on a bad team that wasn't actually translating to winning. But Isaiah would eventually rise to stardom, and that trade will prove to be one of many awful mistakes by the Kings franchise. In that signing trade, Isaiah was signed to a 4-year, $28 million deal. $7 million a year annually will prove to be an absolute bargain considering what Thomas brought to the court. On the Suns, Isaiah's numbers dropped to 15 points and 5 assists per game, but that drop off in production had more to do with the Suns' logjam at point guard. The Suns already had 2 high-quality guards in Eric Bledsoe and Goran Dragic, so as a result, Isaiah had to reduce the role. After averaging 35 minutes a night in Sacramento, his minutes dropped to 25 minutes a game. The Suns quickly realized that their point guard trio experiment wasn't working, so at the deadline, they traded him to Boston for Marcus Thornton and a first-round pick. Once again, a team that underappreciated Isaiah's value will regret trading him because very quickly after that trade, Isaiah proved his worth. In the 21 games that Isaiah played in Boston that year, Isaiah averaged 19 points and 5 assists per game, helping the Celtics to make the playoffs as the 7th seed. They got swept in the first round by Cleveland that year, but this was just the beginning of Isaiah becoming a legend in Boston. The following year, Isaiah upped his averages to 22 points and 6 assists per game and helped to lead the Celtics to the 5th seed in the East. It was extremely impressive that a player once thought to just be a guy putting up empty stats on a bad team to lead the Celtics to 2 consecutive postseasons. The Celtics did an amazing job building around him. It was known league-wide that for all of Isaiah's offensive strengths that he was a defensive liability. He's very athletic, but at just 5'8", it's difficult for him to play good defense. The Celtics perfectly hid Isaiah on defense by surrounding him with great defenders like Avery Bradley, Marcus Smart, and Jay Crowder. As a result, the Celtics were a top 5 defensive team in the 2015-16 season. And while Isaiah's teammates held it down on the defensive end, Isaiah was a force on the offensive end. That same year, Isaiah made his first All-Star team, and when the playoffs started, Boston was matched up against a pretty good Atlanta team. The Celtics lost the series, but Isaiah gave Atlanta the work. Isaiah averaged 24 points and 6 assists per game in that series, including a 42-point game against Atlanta in Game 3. The fact that Isaiah was able to dominate when the pressure was on in the playoffs showed that what he was able to do in the regular season was no fluke. Isaiah was a big-time player, and the bigger the game, the better he was going to play. But next year, the 2016-17 season, was truly Isaiah's best year in the league. That year, Isaiah averaged an insane 29 points and 6 assists per game on 46% shooting. In January of that season, Isaiah averaged 33 points per game. He had the highest points per game in the month of January by any Celtic in league history, a higher scoring average than Hall of Famers like Larry Bird, Paul Pierce, and John Havlicek. That same season, Isaiah Thomas was second in the league in fourth quarter points per game. His 9.8 points per game in the fourth quarter was second to Russell Westbrook by just 2 decimal points. In that year, there was arguably no other player who you would rather want to have the ball during crunch time. When the game was on the line, Isaiah knew how to carry his team to victory. He had so many dominant performances that season. 44 points against the Grizzlies on December 20th, 52 points against the Miami Heat on December 30th. He was legitimately unguardable. How is it that the shortest player in the league could make dominating giants look like child's play. Well, as I said earlier, he may be the shortest, but he's also one of the fastest. That speed, combined with that impressive handle, made him impossible to stay in front of, even against the league's best defenders. He could get it to the paint absolutely at will, and despite his size, he was an excellent finisher. Small players tend to be poor finishers at the rim. Oftentimes, a player under 6 feet tall has a hard time getting their shot off against big men in the paint. But Isaiah Thomas was a crafty finisher. He had amazing touch around the rim, and he had a very strong upper body. Because of that, he could jump into defenders, force them to bounce off of him, and create the space needed to get his layup off. He was excellent at attacking the rim, but he also was a great jump shooter, shooting 38% from 3 and 90% from the free throw line that season. He had a quick and high release that allowed him to get his pull-up jumper off over any defender despite only being 5'8". Isaiah Thomas was virtually unguardable 1v1, and he was impressive not only from an individual standpoint, but from a team standpoint, because his regular season dominance led the Celtics to the #1 seed in the East. That season, Isaiah Thomas finished 5th in MVP voting. He easily had established himself as one of the top superstars in the NBA that season. But it truly isn't the regular season where legends are made, but the postseason. After finishing as the 1 seed, the Celtics seemed destined for a deep playoff run. Tragically, the day before Boston's first round matchup against the Bulls, Isaiah Thomas lost his 22-year-old sister in a car accident. To have to deal with the death of a close family member was absolutely devastating. Nobody would have blamed Isaiah if he missed the next game to mourn the death of his sister, but Isaiah Thomas balled out in her honor, scoring 33 points in Game 1. But sadly, this wasn't enough as the Celtics lost the game, and the Celtics will go on to lose Game 2 as well. What was damning about these losses was that they were both at home. Going down 0-2, with the next 2 games being in Chicago, the series looked over. In the history of basketball, teams that go up 2-0 in a series go on to win the series 93% of the time. Facing that huge deficit and the tragic death of his sister, the odds were immensely stacked up against Isaiah. Most people in his situation would fold, but Isaiah's story is all about overcoming adversity, and through his heart and dedication, he was able to turn tragedy into triumph. In Game 3, Isaiah scored 16 points and 9 assists as Boston destroyed the Bulls by 17 points. In Game 4, Isaiah scored 33 points and 7 assists to lead the Celtics to another win. After going down 0-2, Isaiah Thomas was able to lead the Celtics to 2 straight victories and tied the series, but the job wasn't done yet. Isaiah had 21 points and 9 assists in Game 5 and 12 points and 6 assists as the Celtics destroyed the Bulls by 22 points to close the series. Despite everything stacked against him, Isaiah Thomas was able to beat the odds. Isaiah Thomas proved in that Bulls series that heart is more important than height, that you could overcome anything if you remain resilient. But this was just the first round. In the next series, the Celtics had to face the Washington Wizards. This would be no easy task. The Wizards won 49 games, just 4 less than Boston, and finished as the 4th seed for a reason. Washington had one of the best backcourts in the NBA between Bradley Beal and John Wall. John Wall was another speed demon, except he was a legit 6'4" and a menace on the defensive end. This was the type of series where legends are made. Anything short of his absolute best would likely cause Isaiah Thomas to lose this series. But as you already know by now, Isaiah Thomas is a big time player who's built for the big moments. Isaiah Thomas and John Wall both brought their absolute A game in Game 1. Isaiah dropping 33 points and 9 assists in the series opener, while Wall dropped 20 points and a mind-boggling 16 assists. But Isaiah Thomas ended up on top, and the Celtics took the 1-0 lead. In Game 2, Isaiah and John Wall had a battle for the ages. Wall finished the game with 40 points, 13 assists, 3 steals, and 3 blocks, absolutely stuffing the stat sheet. But Isaiah Thomas was even better, scoring 53 points to lead the Celtics to victory. But despite going up 2-0, the Wizards would not go away quietly. Thanks to the brilliance of John Wall and Bradley Beal, the Wizards won Game 3 and 4 to tie the series. The Wizards and Celtics would split the next 2 games, which means there was just one more winner-go-home Game 7 that would decide who would win the series. The Wizards' star-studded backcourt absolutely showed up. Bradley Beal, 38 points, John Wall, 20 points, 11 assists, but Isaiah Thomas also dominated with 29 points and 12 assists to lead the Celtics to the Game 7 victory. In the most important series of his career, Isaiah absolutely showed out, and now Boston was headed to the conference finals. Next, Isaiah Thomas and the Celtics had their most difficult challenge yet, facing the defending champion Cleveland Cavaliers. Unfortunately, this was where Boston's impressive postseason run would end. Isaiah would score 17 points and drop 10 dimes in Game 1, and in Game 2, he would exit the game early with a hip injury and not return for the rest of the series. Boston would go on to lose to Cleveland in just 5 games. Isaiah didn't know it at the time, but that hip injury would be the beginning of the end of his reign as one of the league's top players. Because what was once ruled a hip strain turned out to actually be a torn hip labrum that would require him to get surgery to repair it just 1 year later. And just 3 months after the playoffs, the Celtics got rid of Isaiah Thomas in a trade to the Cavaliers for Kyrie Irving. Despite Isaiah Thomas giving his heart and soul for the Celtics franchise, they had no problem getting rid of him. It didn't matter to Danny Ainge and the Celtics front office that Isaiah Thomas carried the franchise on his back. It didn't matter that he played hurt. It didn't matter that he played after his sister died. It didn't matter that he got him to the conference finals. It didn't matter that he played a huge role in helping them land All-Star Gordon Hayward by recruiting him that offseason to the Boston Celtics. Isaiah Thomas was nothing more than damaged goods, and when an opportunity came to get rid of their injured franchise player, they took it. It's really funny that fans expect loyalty from these NBA players. Everyone seems to understand that basketball is a business, but to many fans, only NBA teams are expected to behave in their best interests. When LeBron James decided to leave Cleveland after carrying the franchise for 7 seasons, NBA fans were up in arms. But when an NBA team like Boston pretty much does the same thing and screws over their franchise player, nobody bats an eye. It's an egregious double standard, and what really makes the Celtics shady is that they didn't tell him the severity of his injury. Isaiah initially hurt his hip playing for the Timberwolves back in March, but the Celtics medical staff chose not to warn Isaiah about the long-term risk of playing through his hip injury. But don't just take my word for it, hear it from the horse's mouth.
You know, everybody hated Boston for what they did to me. It's a business, I understand it. I'm not tripping on it. The only thing that I think they handled wrong was not explaining to me what the extent of my injury could be if I do play. So that was the biggest thing for me that I disliked, because nobody gave me no insight. Okay, if you do play, right, this can happen.
That decision by the Celtics to not be fully honest with Isaiah Thomas ended up costing him $100 million. If they told Isaiah the risk, Isaiah could have shut it down for the season, rested his hip, and in the summer of 2018, he would have been eligible for a 4-year, $100 million contract. But the Celtics withheld the truth from Isaiah, and as a result, he'll never see that type of money again, at least from an NBA contract. It's an incredibly sad story. Isaiah was never fairly compensated for his MVP caliber production. $7 million a year for what Isaiah Thomas brought to the table for Boston was highway robbery. Between jersey sales, ticket sales, and viewership, Isaiah likely brought in hundreds of millions of dollars to the Celtics organization. he helped them skip what would have been a long rebuild after the Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce era. But sadly, he never made more than $8 million in a season, and his career earnings are only $31 million. Unfortunately for Isaiah, his career went downhill from there. After getting traded to Cleveland, it took Isaiah some time to get back on the court, and when he returned, he looked like a shell of his former self. The quickness that once made Isaiah unguardable was gone, and his ability to knock down shots had all but disappeared. In 15 games in Cleveland, Isaiah averaged 15 points and 5 assists per game, but on just 36% shooting. The Cavaliers were a team that was looking to get back to the finals. They were already having a crisis themselves, so they had very little patience for an Isaiah Thomas that was still working his way back from injury. It was true that Isaiah Thomas was bad. He was not only bad offensively, but he was a disaster defensively. He has always been a horrid defender, but he was so good offensively that his offensive production made up for his defensive shortcomings. Furthermore, in Boston, he was surrounded by great defenders. Unfortunately for Isaiah, those conditions no longer existed in Cleveland. Isaiah Thomas became the scapegoat for the Cavs' problems, even though they were a struggling team before he even stepped foot on the court. Isaiah was eventually traded to the Lakers at the deadline. Isaiah's tenure in LA started off promising, scoring 22 points against the Mavericks, but he continued to struggle with his shooting. In 17 games in LA, he averaged 15 points and 5 assists per game on just 38% shooting from the field. That offseason, the Lakers chose not to bring Isaiah back, so he signed a 1-year, $2 million deal with the Nuggets. In Denver, he at least had an opportunity to prove that he could be a contributor on a young Nuggets team looking to make a playoff push. Unfortunately for Isaiah, that didn't even come into fruition because he became just a third-string player. He only played in 12 games that whole season. The Nuggets got to the second round of the playoffs, but Isaiah played no part of it. Isaiah clearly needed to go elsewhere because there was no big role for him in Denver. In the summer of 2019, Isaiah signed a 1-year deal with the Wizards for $2 million. This was easily his best year after the injury. He averaged 12 points per game and showed he was still a lights-out shooter, knocking down 41% of his threes. But Isaiah was traded to the Clippers at the trade deadline and quickly waived. Since then, Isaiah has barely played. Isaiah did play in 3 games last season for the Pelicans and averaged 8 points per game. The Pelicans signed Isaiah to a 10-day contract, but clearly wasn't impressed because they didn't offer a second 10-day contract after that. That was the last time Isaiah Thomas played in the NBA. As of this recording, no NBA team has signed Isaiah Thomas. He did work out for the Lakers, who have an open roster spot, but a signing with LA doesn't appear to be imminent. Isaiah has said that his only goal is to get back in the NBA and that he's confident that he's still an NBA talent, but he just hasn't caught a lucky break. So what happened? How did an MVP caliber player go from dominating the league to fighting just to sign with any NBA team just 4 years later? The torn labrum was clearly the main culprit. Unfortunately, Isaiah suffered one of the worst injuries a basketball player can endure. There isn't a high success rate for players who suffered this injury. Johnny Flynn is another small guard that suffered the same injury, and his career quickly fizzled out. Flynn was the 6th pick in 2009. He suffered a torn labrum in 2010 and was out the league in 2012. Why is this injury so devastating? Your hips are extremely crucial in running. Suffering the torn labrum takes away a player's speed, which is why the injury causes most basketball players to fall off. It's especially devastating for a player like Isaiah, who relied heavily on his speed to drive by defenders and get into the teeth of the D. No longer could he easily just get by anyone for a nice finish at the rim. That, combined with his defensive issues, really lowered his positive impact, making him a net negative much of the time. Again, had Boston warned Isaiah about the risk of playing on that hip injury, he could have rested up and this would have more than likely extended his prime. Instead, at just the age of 32, Isaiah Thomas is out the league, and who knows if he'll ever get another chance. The story of how Isaiah Thomas went from NBA superstar to out the league just 4 years later should serve as a cautionary tale to NBA players. Yes, you should definitely play your heart out, and being a team player is important, but at the end of the day, basketball is a business, and you have to prioritize yourself first. And hopefully, this also teaches NBA fans not to criticize NBA players for not being loyal. Just like NBA teams do what's in their best interest, it should be fine when NBA players do what's in their best interest. If Isaiah Thomas had sat out the rest of the 2016-17 season to rehabilitate his hip, I'm sure plenty of fans would have called him selfish, but it would have been in his best interest. But hopefully, this isn't the end of the Isaiah Thomas story. Isaiah has overcome incredible odds his entire career, and hopefully once again, he could get back in the league and show that he can still contribute to winning. Anyway guys, that's going to be it from me. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to drop a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and have a great rest of your day.